ليس اليتيم الذي قد مات والده إن اليتيم يتيم العلم والأدب.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to the Islamic Literary Society's podcast. I am your host, Abdul Hai. Throughout human history, societies have always had some kind of hierarchies, system that places some people above others. But nowhere has this been so clear and obvious and harsh as it was and still is in the West. For centuries, Western powers used ideas about science, race, and religion to justify their control and domination over other people. Today we'll be discussing Matthew Carr's latest book, Darwin Savage, Science, Race, and the Conquest of Patagonia. The book looks at how 19th century colonization, scientific theory, and racial idea shape the way people in South America were treated. Matthew Carr is a writer, journalist. His non-fiction book includes, among others, My Father's House, A History of Terrorism, Blood and Faith, The Purging of Muslim Spain. His first novel, The Devil of Cardona, was chosen as the New York Times editor's pick. His journalistic work appeared in The Guardian and other major publications. Matthew, it's great to have you back. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here again.
Thank you for coming. To start off our discussion, could you tell us which region the book focuses on and what its main theme and boundaries are?
So, yeah, sure. I mean, the focus of my book was Patagonia. Patagonia is a kind of, over the few hundred years since it was first supposedly discovered, in commas, by Europeans in 1520, it's always been a kind of magical, mythical place. A lot of stuff gets said about it that isn't true. Some stuff said about that is true. But Patagonia basically occupies the southernmost part of Chile and Argentina. It's basically the southern part of the southern cone. So it's a region that encompasses lots of different kinds of landscape. Desert, not in the sense of sandy desert, but in terms of scrubland, bushes. Then it's got mountains. It has lakes. It has an incredible landscape made up of different kind of plateaus. It has the Andes running down one side of it. It has the Atlantic down the other, and it touches down at what we now call the Strait of Magellan, which was basically for many years the major sea route for Europeans crossing between Europe and the Pacific. So most of Patagonia is in Argentina, but a very good slice of it is also in Chile. And this place is often talked about as the end of the world. That's how Europeans often imagine it, the end of the world. It was one of the worst places you could be sent to as a seaman because basically from the 16th century onwards, to get to the Pacific, you had to go through around Cape Horn, incredibly dangerous route, where loads of ships were wrecked, or you had to go through the Strait of Magellan once that was discovered in 1520. That became the new route, the kind of highway between the two oceans. And once again, very dangerous for sailing ships. Loads of ships were wrecked there. Even if you weren't wrecked, you were likely to spend a very miserable time there, because the weather was often bad. It's quite extreme weather in Patagonia. Not when I was there, I must be said. When I was there, it was delightful. I couldn't understand why people found it so depressing, but that's how it was. That's how it's often been described.
What made, the way you described the place, what made European, and we'll come to Charles Darwin, what made European attractive to the place? Were they looking for something, or was it just something that they discovered?
It depends. There's different phases in this whole process of discovery, really. First of all, people weren't really looking for Patagonia as such. They were looking for a way to the Atlantic. And so Patagonia was discovered almost by accident, really, by the Portuguese explorer Ferdinand Magellan in his round-the-world voyage, which decimated most of his crew, when he passed through the strait that now carries his name, the Strait or the Straits of Magellan. So they kind of noticed Patagonia on the way to somewhere else. And for about 200 odd years, that was pretty much how Patagonia appeared in the writings of Europeans. It was a place you saw from the sea. Mostly what you saw was relegated to the coastlines of the islands at the base. I should have mentioned also at the base of Patagonia, where it kind of where the Straits of Magellan creates that highway between the Atlantic and the Pacific. You have a lot of islands, a whole archipelago of islands, some of which belong to Chile and some of which now belong to Argentina. So it wasn't really till about the late 18th century, early 19th century that people started to develop an interest in what's in Patagonia, not just what they see in passing from one place to another. And then you have this process of European settlement coming from the newly independent countries of Chile and Argentina, which kind of really takes off after the 1850s, because the population had to increase to a certain level when people wanted to move south into Patagonia. And even though Patagonia's historically often been described as like a barren, desolate place, the settlers, particularly in Argentina, recognized that Patagonia offered amazing grazing opportunities for cattle. And later on in Chile, they reckon, European settlers who came to live in Chile saw the southern part of Patagonia, of Chilean Patagonia, and Tierra del Fuego, the island of Tierra del Fuego, the land of fire, as ideal grazing grounds for sheep. So once these industries become implanted and they become profitable, you get these pressures bearing down on the land. And that inevitably brings about more confrontations with the indigenous peoples who already lived in those regions.
Darwin's when he met them first, and he describes them as savage and and a civilized man, against the civilized men. The far. How did this idea make us rethink on how we see people in terms of rank and hierarchies? Some are superior to others.
That's an interesting question. I guess we need to go back a bit before Charles Darwin to get the idea of how that happened. Because when I was saying earlier that people observed Patagonia from the sea, they didn't just see the land, they also saw some of the people. So, you even had people like Francis Drake, Sir Thomas Cavendish, Magellan, various French seamen landing at the coasts of southern Argentina, going round through the Strait of Magellan into the Pacific. And as they went through the Strait of Magellan, they encountered these indigenous people who are now known as the Yagan people or the Yamana people. There was another group called the Haush. There was another one called the Selknam and another one called the Kaueska. So these were all different ethnic groups who were all, except for the Haush, they were all known as canoe Indians. That's how they were described by Europeans, because basically they lived between all the islands, canoeing from one island to another, living off seafood, hunting seafood. They were semi-nomadic. And when Europeans first encountered them, really in the 16th century onwards, they were horrified by them. They thought they were close to animals, is how they described them. They again and again, when you read the descriptions of travelers, seamen, military men, they all had the same horrified reaction to these people. They were like animals. They were savages, essentially. And so this idea of the savage was well implanted in European culture long before the 19th century when Darwin first showed up there. And, this idea of the savage was part of a process kind of unfolding throughout the 17th and 18th centuries of organizing humanity from a European perspective. Because as Europe emerged as a technologically, militarily dominant section of humanity in that period, you had not just you had these sailing ships going on these round the world voyages, and they had different purposes. One purpose might be military conquest, looking for different trading routes, looking to explore supposedly unknown territories so that you could sell things in them and go and buy things and so on. But the other part was scientific. So you had this process in which you had scientists of various kinds who would go on these ships, and their job was to basically record everything they saw: the people, the fauna, the vegetation, the wind currents, everything. And very important was this idea of who the people were that Europeans were encountering. So these people would bring this knowledge back to Europe, where the scientists, most of whom didn't go to these countries, but would use the information they received to work out these kind of hierarchies. You know, who existed on this unknown world? Who were these peoples? Where were we Europeans in relation to them, and what were they in relation to us? And so this idea of the savage, it's an old idea. You could probably trace it right back to classical times, actually, with the Greeks and their idea about barbarians. You know, savage was barbarian. You could be semi-civilized in the way the word was used. Europeans would call the Ottomans barbarians, but they wouldn't call them savages. They would call the Aztecs barbarians, but not savages, even though they had the Aztecs had what Europeans regarded as savage practices, like sacrificing people to the sun god and so on. Nevertheless, they had cities, they had urban structures, they had sophisticated kind of social structures, so they weren't seen as savages. Savages, on the other hand, tended to be indigenous peoples who were at the bottom rung of humanity. And the question was, why were they savage? Was it something to do with, were they like animals? Were they closer to animals than people? What made them like that? Was it the climate? Was it their diet? Or was it, and this during the 19th century, was it biology? Was there something biological or cultural about them that kept them in that savage state? So Darwin, when he went accompanying the Beagle's second voyage of exploration, he had this background. He had these ideas that he took with them. He was familiar with these debates. He was quite curious to see what a savage people actually looked like. In fact, that was one of his it was on his bucket list. Actually, he really even wrote to his friends saying he wanted to see them. And there's a contradiction with Darwin because,
being a scientist, the idea of having imperial or factual knowledge, that would you say Darwin already made his mind up?
No, I wouldn't. Not he made his mind up about some things. There's a kind of paradox about Darwin in that a lot of his science was influenced by debates about slavery. Darwin was a very staunch abolitionist. Him and his whole family were. They were very anti-slavery, and they supported all the campaigns for abolition. Darwin rejected the idea that you could be enslaved because you were of a certain race. He rejected the idea of what they used to call polytheism, the idea that races came from different. They were different. Didn't come from the same human tree. Darwin thought that all human races came from the same human tree, if you like, and part of his science was intended to kind of demonstrate that. And some of his biographers believe that abolitionism was a crucial idea in his science. People don't agree on that. Some people say no, up to a point. Some people disagree with the thesis that everything Darwin did was about slavery, but certainly some of what he did and some of what he thought was about it. But savages were a different category.
First of all, he considered them below almost slavery.
I guess you probably could say that, actually. I mean, in his diaries, his brilliant diaries, which are well worth a read. I mean, they're just amazing descriptions. Basically, when you read his journal, you can see what we now would see as the kind of ideological faults of his age and that he took with him. But you also see the brilliance of his observational power, his great gifts as a travel writer, his ability to kind of conjure up landscapes and peoples. Quite an awesome piece of writing, the Beagle Journal. But there's a description there when he talks about one of the black slaves that he met in Brazil. And this slave said to him that how much he wanted to go home and see his brother and sister again. And Darwin really says how much he felt for him. And, so he saw this slave as a brother, an oppressed brother. But he didn't see savages in the same way, what he called savages. So when his first real sight of a savage was when he showed up in the Strait of Magellan in Tierra del Fuego in 1832, in December 1832. And he saw these Yagan people, these Haush people, rather. He saw these Haush people first, and then he saw these Yagan people. And he was stunned by the sight of them. It's actually difficult for us now in the 21st century to understand why he was so shocked. I mean, some people, nowadays we have an attitude that well, we try to, let's say we don't all do it. But when you go to another country and you go to another place, you try and understand what that place is in its own terms. You don't go there looking to kind of go, oh, well, you're at this level and I'm at this level and this someone else is at this level. Having said that, there are travelers that still do that, has to be admitted. But in Darwin's case, it was it was normal to do that because these European scientists, they believed that they were at the apex of civilization. They believed that they had gained scientific knowledge, technological prowess that had never been achieved before. And it suited, I mean, this is like the early days of the British Empire, but it suited certain kind of Englishmen to think of themselves at the very top of this pinnacle of humanity, that they had achieved levels of civilization that no other country or culture had achieved. And they saw this as a positive thing. The positive thing was to spread this. And of course, if people wouldn't accept it, then sometimes you had to force them to accept it. This was the imperial mission. So Darwin was an early expression of that. So why was he so shocked by the sight of these semi-naked people living on the edge of beaches in the mountains with no proper shelter? The only shelter they had were these little shelters they used to makeshift kind of tents, teepee things they would make out of branches with a few seal skins over them. And Darwin couldn't believe, he thought, why on earth would people come to live in such a terrible place? Patagonia. That was the first thing. Why did the language sound like animal sounds? That's what he said. Why are they cannibals? Darwin believed that they were cannibals. In fact, there's no proof ever that the Yagan people were cannibals. But Victorians and pre-Victorians were obsessed with this idea that savages were eating other people, that they treated their children really cruelly. But for Darwin, there was a kind of scientific question in this. Where do these people come from? And in this, you can see the idea. If you read his diary and then you later read the journal, the published journal, there's a difference really, because in the diary, his thoughts are raw. It's just like, this is what I'm seeing right now. In the journal, it's a bit more reflective. He's like thinking about what he has seen and so on. And so, the question was, are these people an earlier version of us? Were we once like this? And Fitzroy, Captain Fitzroy, the captain of the Beagle, when Fitzroy first saw Fuegians, they used the word Fuegian, by the way, to call all these indigenous peoples Fuegians. In fact, they were different.
It's something that's universal to them.
No, it was because the Tierra del Fuego was the place that at the far south of Patagonia, and Europeans tended to use that as the kind of template for all the indigenous peoples in that part of Patagonia. So they couldn't distinguish between one ethnic group and another. In fact, they were all quite different, spoke different languages for one thing. They didn't necessarily have anything to do with each other. But Fuegians is what they were called. And the interesting thing, I should have mentioned this, is that Fitzroy, in his earlier voyage on the Beagle, he took captives. He took 4 captives and brought them back to England. And it's not clear exactly what he intended to do by this. Fitzroy was a very devout Christian, and he had the idea that these people were in such a terrible state that if he brought them back to England, he brought 5 back originally and 1 died. He thought that if he brought them back to England, he could teach them English manners, how to wear clothes, cut their hair, use a knife and fork, and also teach them Christianity. And then he could return them to their homeland, and they would create this little pro-English space at the tip of South America. It was a wild idea, and it was a wild idea, and the Navy was not particularly keen on it. They didn't really support him very much. It was really Fitzroy's own idea. So those people were on the ship when Darwin came, and that's why he went to Tierra del Fuego, to put them back.
Would you then say there was a conflict between the military expedition of the commanders, of the officers, and those who had the idea of civilization, but a bit with Christianity? So it's a conflict of, we want those people, we want to civilize them, but at the same time they're inferior to us. Was there an internal conflict going on? I mean,
not necessarily. Not necessarily. I mean, you could say actually the two things went hand in hand. As far as Fitzroy just wrote it vaguely about what he hoped to do. I mean, the reason I say it was a wild idea is because Fitzroy was Anglican, and South America, all the countries in South America were Catholic. So the idea that you'd simply go to the tip of South America and set up an Anglican colony was a very ambitious concept. And so for Fitzroy, there was no conflict between religion, military, strategy, and trade. For him, he imagined that, okay, if you put these people back, they'll be pro-English, they'll speak English because we'll have taught it to them. And then when English sailors go through there in the future, they'll have this friendly tribe to help them, and if they need help or food or shelter or whatever. So so in a way, all these things kind of dovetail together. And so you could say that Darwin's first experience of savages was in England when he first met these people. But, and this is the interesting thing, he didn't see them as savages then. He saw them as semi-civilized because they were wearing English clothes, they had their hair cut, and they'd learned a few English words. And then, oh, I should have said it was 4 captives that were taken, not 5, by the way. 4 were taken and 1 died. 1 died in England, one of Fitzroy's captives. So only 3 went back. And so Darwin spoke to these people on the ship and so on, and he was always interested in how civilized they were and how much of the savage there was in them. But for him, to see a savage in the natural state was the crucial thing. And so his first sight of this, what he called this unfathomable wildness, haunted him throughout his life. It was basically as he kind of got more into kind of developed his theories about evolution. Where do people come from? Where do animals come from? Why have there been all these animals that have gone extinct and others have grown and so on? As he tried to answer these questions for himself, it was always in the end about people. But the first book that he wrote about that, 20 years after coming back to England, The Origin of Species, hardly mentioned people. It only talked about nature in general, because he knew what would happen. If he knew that if he mentioned people, he was going to have a massive controversy. So he was very cautious and actually quite timid. So he spent 20 years meditating on that and kind of coming up with doing lots more research based on what he'd seen in Patagonia and other places. And then the next book, The Descent of Man, that's when he really talks about people. And that was written about 20 years later.
So do you think the scientific approach, I mean, taking Darwin's method into consideration and others, and so do you think they somehow justified violence and gave a scientific cover to, violence through, and therefore it made it easier for the travelers of the military to take over without feeling that human kind of because now they believe they have a religious as well as scientific approach, a justification. Do you think the Darwin was part of that movement?
I do think he ended up being part of it, but not intentionally. Darwin was a very gentle and humane man who was shocked by any manifestation of cruelty, whether it was done to animals or done to humans. And also Fitzroy is a complicated character, very depressed, melancholy character. He committed suicide in the end. He committed suicide like his uncle by the same means, cutting his own throat. And Fitzroy had a very sad career after the Beagle. And the reason he took Darwin with him was because he was afraid that he would become depressed, and that he needed a gentleman, as they called it, to talk to and keep him company. That's why Darwin went. So these 2 men were not violent men. They were not intent on conquest. They felt genuine sympathy for the Fuegians, as they called them. But the sympathy was also matched by a complete condescension and a total inability to understand the Fuegians as the people in a culture in their own right. And this was very, very typical of the science of the time. This was a long period, really, we can get into that later, in which if you were a civilized society, if you had a sophisticated culture from a European point of view, you had to have a town or a city. You couldn't have a sophisticated culture or a language if you were some primitive people, as they saw it, primitive in commas, living in the middle of nowhere with no fixed shelters. So Darwin and Fitzroy felt genuinely sorry for these people, but their sorrow was also steeped in racism, essentially, because they couldn't see that these people actually had constructed a life in this place. That, this place in the south of Patagonia that Europeans were so horrified and overwhelmed by, these people, for thousands of years had learned how to live there. They'd learned how to manage that environment. They learned how to survive in it. They had a culture and a language of their own. But Darwin and co. couldn't see that. So if you broaden this out beyond them, the intentions of these two, what you say is absolutely right, is that in the course of the 19th century, science was seen as a hallmark of civilization. And it was often used as a justification for removing savage, so-called savage peoples from the lands they occupied. So this is different from slavery, say. This is different from an earlier period in slavery in which basically Europeans wanted industrialized slavery. And so they basically took millions of slaves from Africa to work in the New World. This is a question of land. This is the question of settler colonialism here. And so with settler colonialism, it's not just about using people's labor, it's having the land that they already occupy. And so, yeah, sorry, go on.
So you're saying that occupation took place, or taking the land from the people, was through using religion, military, whatever comes.
Whatever comes, and sometimes all at the same time. I mean, if we get into the settler colonialism, there's an encounter very famous encounter in the diaries, took place in 1833, in which Darwin went on a ride into the hinterland of Argentina from Bahia, from the mouth of the river Negro, just south of Bahia Blanca. And he wanted to do this for purely scientific reasons. He wanted to kind of investigate the geology and the fauna of the inland of Argentina. And also he was seasick a lot of the time. He found being on a ship miserable, and he wanted to get off the ship. So he took any advantage he could to go on these inland expeditions. And in this one, he arrived right in the middle of a vicious military campaign that was being waged by who was then the governor of Buenos Aires province, General Manuel Rosas. And Rosas was, Rosas was Rosas was a general who was also a cattleman. So he had a long history of dealings with indigenous peoples in his estates further north in Buenos Aires. And so he could speak the languages of some of the indigenous peoples there. He was very familiar with them, but he had gone on that campaign in order to wipe them out, or at least drive them south and create more land for Buenos Aires cattlemen. And Darwin arrived in the middle of that campaign and rode through it with a small military escort and with Rosas's permission. And this is when you start to see the kind of ambivalence that Darwin had about this whole process. On one hand, Darwin kept hearing stories of incredible violence being meted out towards the indigenous peoples, mostly Tehuelche, Rankel, and Mapuche tribes who were around there. Rosas basically gave them the choice: you submit to the authority of Buenos Aires, and if you don't, we'll kill you. We'll kill all of you, not just you, the fighting men, but women and children as well. And he did that. And that's how he kind of conquered that part of the South. And once he'd kind of pacified, as he put it, those peoples, he stopped and withdrew to Buenos Aires. So Darwin saw the beginning of this campaign, and he was just horrified and disgusted by the violence that he heard. At the same time, he saw it as useful. He saw the promise that could come out of it. At one point in his diary, he comments, okay, well, if all this is a terrible war that's going on, but in 50 years' time, if these people are cleared out, this will make amazing ranch lands, and so on. So he saw it as a scientist, and he saw it as a businessman, as a businessman who recognizes a good situation when he sees one. And so, in this case, what he was actually observing was a process that was taking place across the world at different times in different European colonies. You could see it in Africa, in Kenya later on. You could see it in Australia with the Aborigines. And yes, as you said before, science was often seen as, why are we conquering these lands? It's not just to become rich or to provide grading land. It's in the interests of science, because these are people outside science, incapable of reason. They occupy the land, but they're not worthy of the land. Therefore, we need to remove them. And so, yes, they would go on these military expeditions to the south, accompanied by astronomers, geologists, geographers, all checking out the land, partly to see what was useful and what wasn't, and also because science was seen as a worthy activity in itself. To do these things, to discover these unknown lands, was seen as elevating your civilization to a higher level. So yes, you get this overlap between science, military conquest, and sometimes religion as well.
Was there a point in Darwin's career where he thought to himself, or he felt that it's maybe in order to collect a good, reliable data about the native, that we should talk to the native? And was there a particular person or native that came to Darwin and his team and said, look, maybe you want to hear our story? Was there some such relationship and communication between them at some point?
Well, there was when he went as a passenger on the Beagle, his main source, if you like, was this guy called Jemmy Button. That was the name that Jemmy Button was a young Yagan man who Fitzroy took prisoner. And when I say I should, by the way, just go over this, that when I say take prisoner, Fitzroy took them away from their homeland for nearly 2 years without telling them anything. They had no, they weren't asked. They just were on the ship, and that was that. And so Jimmy Button spoke some English, and he would answer some of Darwin's questions on board. In fact, one time Darwin asked him if you eat people, and Jemmy Button made some comment that could have meant yes, but people who later came to know the Yamana people better claim that basically he was just saying whatever Darwin wanted to hear. It was like, okay, you're going to ask me this question. Sure, we eat people. Like fine, if that's what you think. So very unreliable. But when Darwin began to kind of get more into the anthropological side of his science after writing Origin of Species, he did write letters to people all over the world. But the thing is, his sources were mostly settlers. He asked them, he'd say to them, what expressions do these people have in this situation? How do they react to children? How do they treat animals? And so on. So he had this very detailed questionnaire. It was very common, actually, of the period for Europeans to do this. The British Association for the Advancement of Science had a specific questionnaire they would give to all European travelers and try and say, bring back evidence, answer these questions if you can. So the thing is, Darwin never seemed to question the fact that the people he was asking questions about might be people with their own specific agendas. So yes, he would ask missionaries, he would ask local magistrates, soldiers, farmers. At one point, he asked this guy, the guy, are the natives learning English? To somebody in the Cape Colony, what became South Africa. He said, are they learning English? And this white farmer wrote back to him and said, there have been some people have learned English, yes. And he included a letter from a local, I can't remember what tribe he was a member of, it might have been a Xhosa tribesman who said that he had learned English and he now had a European name. And Darwin wrote back saying how great it was that this man had learned English and that he'd shown that he could rise, he could progress. So the white farmer wrote back to Darwin saying, you people need to be more careful about this. These people are not supposed to rise. But that was the gist of his reply. We are settlers. We are settlers dealing with these people. We are in a confrontation with them. We don't want you do-gooders coming over here and trying to give them ideas above their station.
So the whole idea of the settlers and discovering the others is essentially a racist kind of movement. Would you say that?
I suppose it depends. I guess you have to think of what comes first: the cart or the horse. I mean, if you want to take settler colonialism for a start is quite different to kind of more indirect forms of colonialism. It's not just like it's not like, say, in India, where the British took control of institutions of government. And kind of controlled the country that way and then imposed their own. Settler colonialism is basically you or us. You are there, we are here, we want the land you are on. So the genocide scholar Patrick Wolfe, he used to say that that basically in questions of land, it's always a question of life or death. Only one group of people can exist on that land. I'm sure you can think of contemporary parallels to this. And so, you know, the question is, okay, that's your situation. That's what you want. So do you tell yourself that the people you're going to take from, going to remove from this land, do you tell yourself that these people are not worthy? So it's hard to tell which comes first. The desire to appropriate and the desire to construct a whole narrative that says this is why we're appropriating. It's not just for me; it's for science. Or who can say? But certainly the two go hand in hand throughout the 19th century. You can see this, and it often shows itself in this concept of extermination. Extermination is a word that Darwin uses a lot in his science, and sometimes it's not always clear what does he mean by it. You know, sometimes he uses the word extermination, which seems to mean like extinction. You know, something ceases to exist. But exterminate, as we know, has a different meaning, which is to make people not exist. And sometimes Darwin seems to move between the two. And it's interesting that he does, because he saw what he regarded as a war of extermination when he witnessed General Rosas's campaign. He saw this campaign happening. He thought this was a war of extermination, what we would now call a genocidal war. And so this idea of extermination was constantly linked to settler colonialism, in the sense that a lot of colonial authorities, particularly in Britain, the British government began to notice that terrible things were happening to indigenous people in most of their colonies. And the British, they created a parliamentary commission to investigate why this was happening and see if they could stop it happening. The thing is, the interests of the British government were not necessarily the same as the interests of the settlers in those territories. And so you get these narratives coming back from the British colonial territories saying, you know, these people are doomed to disappear. All we're doing is helping them. You would get people would say, yes, it's tragic. It's tragic to have to watch this. It's like watching the white rhinoceros. The last rhinoceros. They had the same narratives were applied to people. So you get this kind of strange concept, which some people call doomed race theory, in which you basically, it's kind of, well, it's a terrible tragedy, but science means it has to happen. And then, of course, Darwin's ideas were used, regardless of what he wanted or not, they were used to justify that kind of thinking.
Do you think, had Darwin been alive now, his idea of looking at those people would be different, considering his Christian value or the compassionate value that he has would be different from, from what I mean. I understand Darwin is a man of his time, but I'm just trying to separate him from time and him being individual. So do you think he was pressured by his time to conclude what he concluded, or was there something that he had in him and he just kind of navigated close?
That's an interesting question, really. It's hard to know. Was it just a blind spot? The blind spot that came with being, he was, upper class gentleman who was steeped in the ideas of his time. Certainly, he had these ideas. On the other hand, in some ways, he differed from them, as we were talking about before, in his attitude to slavery. But it's striking how he didn't budge on this issue of the savagery of the Fuegians, even when it was pointed out to him that he was wrong. The missionary Thomas Bridges, who later established the first successful mission in Tierra del Fuego. Thomas Bridges was a great linguist, and he collected the first and only, actually, dictionary of the Yagan language. And he found that it was extraordinarily sophisticated language. It would have things like, 20 different names for a beach, depending on which angle you were looking at the beach. It also had all these different words for emotions, love, heartbreak, all the things that humans feel. And he did point this out to Darwin, but Darwin never seemed to kind of move. He never moved away from this idea of the Fuegians being cannibals. He never really, put it this way, he never seemed to wrap his head around the idea that you could be living in a situation that seems primitive, technologically speaking, because these people don't have houses, they're not using metal weapons and instruments and so on, but they still could have the same emotions that you have, the same feelings for their children. They could fall in love, they could fall out of love, um, all these things. That they had this whole mythological conception about how the world was created, and so on. He just didn't seem to be able to get there. So I suppose you could say that that was a kind of an intellectual limitation that he had. And every time he tries to, you see it again and again in his writings, he sort of approaches these people, but he always comes back to this visual image of the savage standing on a rock, covered in paint, screaming. And he always assumed that these Fuegians, as he called them, were unhappy. Um, and in that's what this was the typical idea of the savage that he inherited and also contributed to in his own writings. The idea that happy people are civilized people because they have hospitals, asylums, prisons, and all schools and all this kind of thing. Anyone who doesn't have those things has got to be miserable. And so that in that kind of case, you get the idea: if they're miserable, then you can save them. Hence the missions.
So, I mean, moving on to our contemporary world from Darwin's time, I mean, the Western civilization is obviously built up on certain ideas and certain values, and the Enlightenment or the time when Darwin was writing is kind of the peak of discovery. Do you think, broadly speaking, the ideas of the civilized and savage still influence today's discussion? If it's not open in a closed door or in literature, do you think that still exists? Do we have, in other words, modern Darwin, Charles Darwin, or do we have modern approach to a theory that Darwin came up with, far as human and others are concerned?
Not necessarily we do, but I don't think the thing about this idea of the civilized and the savage is over history it takes different forms and takes different ideas on board. You first really can see the beginnings of it in European culture, at least in the ancient Greece, Athens. In Athens, Athens saw itself as a democratic state that was the most civilized state in the world that it knew at the time. And the word barbarian comes from a Greek word barbaros, which means people who speak a different tongue, an incomprehensible tongue. And so they had their own way of understanding what the barbarian was, which is cultural and political. In Darwin's time, it was more about biology and race. It was understood. And the question is, what is the savage? The savage is someone who is untamed, is wild, who is violent, who doesn't have the same emotions that civilized people have. The interesting thing about this, of course, is that some of the most violent things ever done in human history have been done by civilized societies using civilized weapons. And that's still the case. So, I still remember Berlusconi in 2001, shortly after 9/11, saying that Afghans would have to learn the superiority of Western civilization. So, in other words, if you think about the way that Israel often talks about Gazans, I mean, I remember because I've been to Gaza 3 times in the past, back in the 1980s, and in those days, Gaza was seen as a kind of Wild West place to Israel. People would say things like, "Oh, you don't want to go to Gaza." In other words, it was a savage place. But the savagery wasn't understood in Darwinian terms. It wasn't about levels of civilization. It was about that somehow in these people they had a capacity for violence and brutality, which of course I never encountered in Gaza. But I quote this just to say that every age can find its ways of distinguishing between the civilized and the savage. And what sometimes happens, the more you kind of depict a certain group of people as savage, the more you justify to yourself your right to annihilate them, just as they did in the 19th century. I've read things recently about over the last 2 years about Gaza. People saying things like they don't have any right to exist. They don't have any right to be who they are. I have no right. They've lost any right they had. They've detached themselves from the mass of humanity, of civilized humanity. Therefore, turn Gaza into a car park. You know, you see this kind of stuff all the time, and not only by people, fringe people lurking on the internet. You know, so these things are always available to different generations and different ages, and bringing in different ideologies and different sources.
Do you think there is an inherited concept of superiority in the mind of the West, the European? I mean, it just comes with the package. If you're from Europe, you have that. Whether you nurtured it to go to the Darwinian level of inherited concept of we are better than the others in the mind of European, at least the ruling class.
Any group of people can use these kind of parallels, but it's certainly true that because Europe has spent, well, 400 odd years really of being the kind of dominant. I mean that is probably waning now. To be honest, that is probably. I feel like the kind of European power has possibly reached its limits. But nevertheless, over the last 400 years, Europe has achieved an extraordinary military and economic and cultural domination over various parts of the world. And if you're in that position for that long, it's going to become a little bit part of your DNA.
But Europe, as we know it, and obviously in a globalized village now, where communication and transformation is so mixed. Do you think such idea will survive? The reason I'm asking this is because as we develop, it seems that, at least to me, it seems that part of human nature, at least from the West and the European, is developing out as well. Like you say, it's taking different shapes and forms, but it's still there. Is there a point, do you think, that can be removed and have this picture of human being in a way that is all being equal and from a European perspective?
We have made some progress towards it. I mean, nowadays it's quite rare, for example, to see indigenous peoples in the way that Darwin and his contemporaries saw them. Nowadays, there's much more willingness to understand and see that cultural sophistication is not necessarily around who has a city and who has built the best weapons and so on. So that is a kind of progress. Anthropologists no longer talk about the savage in the way that anthropologists of the 19th century did. So you can have intellectual progress, you can have a widening of, you can have rights and laws that come out of these things, you can have processes of historical reparation. The question is, though, all this can be turned back. Just because you've reached a certain point of intellectual and moral progress does not mean it's permanent. Bearing in mind that in the Enlightenment, in the European Enlightenment, one of the contradictions of it was that people who of the 18th and 19th century believed that they were ending an age of superstition and fanaticism, and that the world would be happier and better for it. And so, people like Darwin, when they spoke about the inevitable triumph of the white race, which Darwin did he did use that language sometimes. Basically the weaker races would die out. These people didn't foresee that within about 30 years of writing that, there would be World War I, followed by World War II, the most catastrophic war in European history, caused by Europeans, civilized Europeans fighting other civilized Europeans. They didn't see that a country like Germany, the most cultured country in Europe, would succumb to Nazi barbarism. So these questions of barbarism is not just a question of what's inside and what's outside. The idea is the civilized core and the barbarian periphery. Barbarism can emerge in any society. And I always think that's a huge, when I read all these things now, I mean, it wasn't much fun reading a lot of these 19th century anthropologists because it's so dismally racist, a lot of the stuff they said. And it's so repetitive as well, so tediously repetitive. A lot of it, there's no kind of data to back it up. It's quite, you have these giant books, written about why such and such a race is going to be annihilated by the Celtic races or the Anglo-Saxon races and so on. No one defines who these races are. What does it mean to be Anglo-Saxon? What is a race? It's all woolly stuff, but they just go on for pages and pages. So when you get to the 20th century and you start reading thoughtful anthropologists like Claude Lévi-Strauss, it's a total different ballgame. But Lévi-Strauss, look, he was doing all his work against this background of World War and European conflict. So in answer to your original question, I would love for us to reach that point. But there's 7 billion people on this planet. 7 billion. And that's a lot of people with a lot of different tensions and conflicts going on. How we get to that point of unity, I don't know how it is, but it must be based in the end on what one of Darwin's original insights, that we are all brothers at some point and sisters. But that's a very, to say that is one thing, to reach it, very, very difficult.
On this note, we shall leave it, and it's been an interesting discussion, and as usual, it's always a great to have you, Matthew.
Fantastic to be here. I really enjoyed it. Thank you. And
thank you to all our listeners and joining the Islamic Literary Society's podcast. Don't forget to visit our website, www.islamicliterarysociety.com. Share your thought and leave a comment. And inshallah, we will see you in our next episode. والسلام عليكم.
ليس اليتيم الذي قد مات والده إن اليتيم يتيم العلم والأدب